Good morning. Welcome everyone to the Voice of Authority webinar on our regular Thursday 11 a.m. slot. My name's Toby Fox. I'm the Managing Director at 3Fox, which is the marketing agency for local authorities. We've been running over 30 events a year for 16 years now, bringing the private and public sectors together. And we're trying to keep that conversation going during the pandemic, working through the medium of webinars. We'll be hosting a regular webinar every Thursday, 11 a.m. And next Thursday, we're going to be turning our attention to employment space and asking what do we want of workspace and commercial development post-pandemic? What does it all look like? Hope you'll join us for that. But today's topic is, what is the council's role in the town centre of 2021? It was inspired by Simon Miller, the cabinet member for Waltham Forest. I hope you're out there listening, Simon, watching, who mentioned in passing during a conversation that councils might have to get used to the idea of running pubs, and what would that look like? And it inspired a whole set of thoughts and questions to other council people and consultants around London and the country about how far council intervention might go post-pandemic to get our town centres up and running, and what do our town centres want and need, and what do we want and need from them. This session is brought to you by the consultant Montagu Evans. No one knows more about town centres than Montagu Evans, in my experience of working with them for many years now. And I'm very grateful to them for making this session possible. And on Monty's behalf, delighted to welcome our panel of speakers, which includes Mark Bradbury, who is Director of Property and Economy at Enfield Council, Dawn Hudd, who is Assistant Director for Physical and Cultural Regeneration at Medway Council, and Conor McDonagh, who is Assistant Director of Economic Growth at Ealing Council. And they're joined, speaking on behalf of the private sector, by Alan Harris, who is Partner and Head of Town Centres at Montagu Evans. It's a fantastic panel, wide-ranging experience, and lots to offer the conversation. So I'll just very quickly run through the programme. We're going to spend 5 minutes with each panel member talking a little bit about successful strategies that have already been applied to town centres and some of the difficult situations town centres were in even before COVID hit, and what the effect of the pandemic has been on those strategies. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what post-pandemic looks like. What is the recovery going to look like? And are there any initiatives or interventions or innovations that our panel members would particularly like to see to come in to support town centres through that recovery? So with no further ado, I beg your pardon, after all of that, there will be a chance to question our panels. So there's a Q&A function on Zoom. Please feel free to use it. We welcome your questions, and please vote for questions that have already been put on that Q&A facility, and we'll pick out the 2 or 3 most popular questions and try and put those to the panel at the end of this session. And that'll all happen around 11:45, and we'll wrap up at midday so you can get on to the rest of your busy days. Okay, so no further ado, let's turn to the first member of our panel, Mark Bradbury at Enfield Council. Mark, what can you tell us about successful strategies that you've been applying in Enfield, the borough of North London, and how COVID has affected those strategies?
Thanks, Toby, and morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Just before I do that, just intrigued by the suggestion we might be running pubs. I've been around a bit, worked for a number of local authorities, and in a few of those, we've actually had pubs as part of our property portfolio. Always a sense of hilarity amongst members. So it's probably not the first time that local authorities might have to do such a thing. But actually, it's an interesting point. We'd already been looking at what our role was, both as a facilitator, but also as an actor in town centres, and I think this only highlights that we're probably going to have to do more of that. Enfield is an outer London borough, a borough of 2 halves, quite an affluent west, with a population that largely commutes down the Piccadilly line into central London, and a less affluent east, where most of the population, and this is a generalisation, but most of them rely on local employment rather than commuting into town. We've got a series of town centres, not one that's particularly dominant. And therefore we've been having a strategy that's based on a combination of things that are common to all and things that are specific to the local. And that's really important before, and it's going to be important again after and during the current crisis, because we've all heard talk about clone towns and the need for towns to have their own identity. One of the key things we've been doing to enable us to reflect that prior to this current position was engaging with local business groups and also importantly the communities that use each of those centres, getting them together, getting groups of people who can traditionally may not have met jointly. They might have just lobbied in different directions separately. So residents associations, transport action groups, people wanting more cycling, people wanting less cycling, and that'll be dear to Toby's heart. And those business groups and their particular needs, and building that dialogue so that we've got a local perspective. And that's been crucial in the current circumstance. The fact we had those networks in place has meant that the ability to liaise with those businesses, to understand their challenges and to communicate with them has been fundamental. So, you know, we'd started to put together action plans for some of those town centres. We'd started to look at where master plans were appropriate. We'd started to look at the use of large-scale initiatives. We have a successful livable neighbourhoods bid for Enfield Town. For those who are not London-based, livable neighbourhoods is a mayor-backed scheme to invest in public realm, to invest in more space for active travel and create town centres that are less car dominated. We got active bids for further livable neighbourhoods funding elsewhere. The Mayor has a good growth fund as well, which uses some business rates money that's pooled to support investment, and we've been successful in getting a bid for Angel Edmonton, one of the high streets in the less affluent part of the borough. So we've got a lot of work going on already, a lot of dialogue, and as I say, that's really stood us in good stead. And I think the easiest way to describe what we're doing now, and the stuff that I'll come on to that we're layering on top of that, is that we're doing all of that, but we're probably doing it on speed. So, you know, what had we thought about doing that we really need to crack on and do? And you know, one of the things that we've been doing is digital training for small businesses. How do they get into the bricks and clicks market so that they're not just constantly you know, looking at Amazon with envy? They're able to offer that balance between a personal physical experience and the convenience of buying online. So we've accelerated that because it's clear that those shops that can't open but don't have an online platform are missing out, and Amazon are reaping the benefits. So we've partnered with a website called Shop Appy, and that now enables local businesses to get an online platform, to have a delivery partner without having to find a delivery partner, to have an online payment system without having to set that up, and get trading online really quickly. We launched that on Monday. There's already a number of people on the site and a number of people joining it. So really, you know, those people who can't trade traditionally, giving them a really quick route to get into that market, and we're promoting that. We're working with the Mayor's Pay It Forward scheme. For those, again, who are not London-based, the Mayor of London has worked with a crowdfunding platform to enable consumers to say, well, actually, I'm going to need a haircut after this, and most of us are in that boat. And actually, I could pay for that now by buying a voucher through a crowdfunding platform, so that hairdresser has got the cash flow in the meantime and can survive. So a lot of this in the initial wave is about how do we accelerate stuff we were already doing? How do we enable businesses to survive this so that the strategies that we'll come on to talk about a little bit later mean that actually we've got some businesses to work with. We're not complacent. We know that we're going to have some holes in the high street, some bigger holes than we had before, some people that were on the verge tipped over it, and some others that we thought were fairly healthy. But the more we can keep afloat, the better. So, you know, those have been the focus of the last few weeks. You know, alongside getting the business rates bills sorted, getting the business grants through the small business or the retail and hospitality grant scheme out there, and we've been very successful about that.
Some really impressive and progressive strategy,
yeah.
Mark. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's the now, and obviously I'll let others get a word in, and then we come and talk about some slightly more strategic stuff that we think needs to be done going forward.
Perfect, absolutely ideal. Just before we move on to Connor, I just mentioned that throughout this webinar we will be running a series of polls for the audience. We've got approaching 300 people watching now, so it'd be really interesting to get your views on some of the questions that we're putting out on the poll. I'm about to launch the first one, so while you listen to Connor, a poll will appear on the screen. It'll soon be replaced by another, and at the end of this webinar we'll be putting the results, the research, on our Voice of Authority website for everyone to have a look at. So Connor, let's talk about Ealing. How does West London's experience differ from North London's, both before COVID and during the pandemic?
Well, firstly, Toby, thanks for inviting me to this webinar, and hello to everybody out there watching this. Thanks for your time. I have to confess, I only joined Ealing 6 months ago, so I haven't developed any specific strategies for Ealing yet in regards to their town centres. But what I have been doing for the last 6 months is working within the council and working with key partners with scoping out an economic growth strategy for the borough. So I can give a bit of insight into that, and I can also give a bit of insight into what I've been doing over the last 3 or 4 weeks since the pandemic hit us in terms of supporting our local businesses. Just to start on that, I'm fully immersed now in the emergency response for our local businesses. So business as usual is gone for me. So this webinar is a bit of light relief for me to actually talk about potentially recovery phase. The first thing we were doing is ensuring all our businesses could access the business rate relief and the grants. So thanks to the hard work of our business rates team, we've now issued over 4,000 grants to our businesses. We also set up a business survey in Ealing, and we've had over 1,000 responses already to that within a week or so. And that's outlining all the key concerns that these businesses have. And we're working very closely with the 3 bids that exist in Ealing, and also the West London Business Partnership, who represent businesses across the sub-region, and in particular all those businesses in Park Royal Industrial Estate, which is the largest industrial estate in the UK. So my time has been fully immersed in that, and I'm learning lots of new things, learning a lot more about Ealing, getting a real good opportunity to meet lots of businesses, lots of partners that I might not have otherwise met before. So I'm really looking at this as a really fantastic opportunity to build more resilient relationships with our businesses. Another good thing as well that's come out of this is how many businesses are really keen to connect with the local communities and vice versa. So it's all about how local people who live in Ealing want to support the local businesses. So I think this pandemic's really enhanced that opportunity. So in terms of the wider stuff I've been doing, Ealing's really interesting borough. It's classed as an out of London borough, but you could potentially say it's more of an inner London borough, because with the advent of Crossrail happening, whenever that happens, it's been delayed now a couple of years, but we're going to have 5 Crossrail stations going right through the borough. So that's going to give access to the CAS in central London and also direct access to Heathrow. We also have the high-speed 2 terminus now coming forward in the north-east of the borough as part of the Old Oak Common and Park Royal development area. So that's going to make a huge difference to Ealing's economy as well. And just going back to Heathrow briefly, Heathrow, Ealing residents total about 6,000 employees for Heathrow, so it's a massive employer in the borough. So the way I see Ealing at the moment is, where's the economy going to pivot? Is it going to pivot more towards Heathrow? Is it going to pivot more towards the east, towards central London, or more towards the north, where high speed 2 is going to be? So there's a fine balancing act for Ealing to look at here, and how we really ensure that the economy gets the benefits of all of those amazing infrastructure enhancements to the borough. We currently have 18,000 businesses in Ealing, spread across 5 town centres, and over a third of those businesses are within the professional services, wholesale, retail and construction sectors, and that sort of signifies the fact that Ealing also has quite a lot of strategic industrial land, so we're quite lucky in that regard as well. So one of the things that I'm seeing from this pandemic is how weak the manufacturing and production economy currently is in the UK, when we're actually having to rely on the rest of the world to manufacture lots of PPE, etc. So maybe there's an opportunity here to really have a stronger look at our industrial areas and the role that they would play as part of the recovery. And as I say, Ealing's quite lucky in that regard, because we've got largest waves of SIL, and the London plan has actually asked us to enhance that further. So that's something really big that I'll be working on in the next few months. So that's the sort of big macro picture in Ealing. I'll give you, in terms of the micro picture, there's an area in Ealing known as North Hudd. That's in the sort of the northwest of the borough, so directly above Heathrow. And it's an area of quite low density housing. There isn't a town centre there at the moment. There isn't many amenities there. There isn't any social infrastructure really there. So it's an area that we're looking at quite closely. And quite excitingly, there's potential to create a brand new town centre in North Hudd, or at least a new centre of commerce and productivity. So we're actually working with consultants at the moment to scope out where that town centre might be located, and what role Heathrow might need to play in that, what role High Speed 2 might need to play in that. So there's a real exciting opportunity for the borough to actually create a brand new town centre. So it'll be really interesting to hear fellow panellists and all the questions that come in on how we address existing town centres, but potentially develop new ones and repurposing the existing high streets we have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at risk of anthropomorphizing town centres, talk about a baptism of fire for a new town centre, but maybe leading the way. You know, maybe it's a great opportunity to build something that's perfectly adapted to the situations that we face now. That's great, Connor. Thank you very much. So that gives us a view of 2 different areas of London, 2 different outer London boroughs. Let's move outside London now and ask Dawn about Medway in the southeast of England, and the strategies that she's been working on in the town centres there, and how COVID has affected them.
Thanks, Toby. Hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. Really interesting to hear what colleagues have already been saying. And, you know, we're doing a lot of that as well. We're doing the NMDR relief and the grants, pushing those out as quickly as we can. We've had a helpline, a COVID-19 helpline set up by the Kent and Rich Chamber of Commerce. And we've had hundreds of businesses from Medway who have contacted us via that. And our South East Local Enterprise Partnership has also been running business surveys. So we've got some live data about what the effect has been of the COVID-19 outbreak on our businesses. Just to give some context, Medway is made up of 5 towns. They've all got different challenges and opportunities. Rochester's a destination, it's full of heritage, huge visitor economy, and very much made up of independent shops. And that is probably faring the best and will come out of this the best. We've also got Strood Town Centre, which is very, very retail based, but lots of major supermarket retail. So they're faring quite well. And Gillingham has had problems before COVID-19, and they will continue. Our challenge in Gillingham is that we have very little property ownership, and therefore our interventions there are quite challenging. And we have Raynham, which is more of a rural town centre. I'm going to focus mostly on Chatham, which is our main town centre, and where we've been making most of our interventions and focusing on pre-COVID-19 by doing lots and lots of things. We've put all our efforts into one place, decided that an intense concentration on one town centre at a time would give us more opportunity to have a real impact. So we've done a huge number of things. We've bought the shopping centre last year, spent £35 million on buying the main shopping centre. We're just in the process of acquiring the office block that sits above that. We have bid successfully to create the High Street Heritage Action Zone, £3.2 million project there about bringing historic buildings back into use in the land that connects Chatham to Rochester. We have a final bid going into Future High Streets Fund next month. We got through the first stage of that, and we've been busily changing that bid over the last few weeks to adapt to the new circumstances. It's really difficult because you'd have to do a full Green Book appraisal on all of the projects. So our consultants are working really hard with us to adapt to that. And that's really, I think what we were going to do, the primary focus of that bid, I don't think has changed, because it was about creating strong gateways to the high street, improving public realm, working with our universities to create new innovative businesses and incubation space, and developing commercial business accelerator spaces where people can test their products and bring products to market through subsidised space. And a lot of it was to do with our Pentagon assets and bringing more civic uses into the town centre and increasing footfall by bringing in new civic uses, which will encourage more footfall and bring more vitality into our town centre. We've also done a number of public realm projects which are really making it more of a destination for people to come for other reasons rather than just for shopping. And going forward, I think that's going to be really critical to reinvigorating our town centres, bringing in, making them destinations and bringing in more reason for people to come in with their families. It's not just about shopping, it's about leisure, it's about food and beverage, it's about culture. And in the second half of this seminar, I'll talk to you about some of the ideas we've got going forward. We're also developing town centre living is a real massive focus for our high streets, and I think that's going to become even more important because the amount of retail space in our town centres is usually over provided. So our whole of our planning, our local plan policies around our town centres are focusing on reducing that retail space and bringing other uses in and bringing more town centre living. So we're developing our own apartment blocks in Chatham. We're developing 170 odd units ourselves through our Medway development company, and we are looking at what we will do with the old Debenham site. We're hopeful to acquire that and do a mixed-use development scheme on the Debenham site. We are benefiting from the fact that all 5 of our town centre stations have high-speed one links now, so that's really helping with getting more commerce into the town centres where people can access their customers, although if everyone carries on working at home, we might not need to get around by train so much. We also already had an established group of town centre networks with businesses and the communities, and they have really come into their own during this, where we're able to quickly speak to our businesses and our community groups and ask them what the challenges are and what we can do to help. And we've got huge ambition for Medway, which is the unitary authority, and we're going for City of Culture in 2025. We're not pulling out of that, we're really focusing on it. We think it's something that will really help drive our economy and help us come out of what's going on at the moment with a very, very positive attitude to our place. And at the end of the day, this is what this is all about. It's about place making and place shaping and redefining our town centres, which I think those that were thinking about retail and where we are with retail were already thinking about redefining our town centres. And I think what COVID-19 has done for us is accelerate that thinking and that process and really think actually there's a big opportunity here in some ways to do things very, very differently in the future.
Yeah, just as Connor mentioned it with regard to Northolt as well. Yeah, thank you very much indeed for that, Dawn. Now, Alan, if there are any points in any of those presentations that you'd like to pick up on, please feel free. And also perhaps with reference to, in particular, to the concept and the question that's most popular at the moment on the Q&A channel is, our town centres were already overpopulated in terms of retail. They were already heading for a fall. So do we need some sort of recognition of that in the strategies that are going forward?
Sure, thank you. I'm actually just going to flip onto screen share just for one moment. So you can see my screen. And just go through some quick slides. I think what's very evident from all of the speakers today is that everyone's strategy is very different. So when it comes to actually being able to consider and look at a strategy, there's no one answer that's the same, and that's been very obvious from all of the different councils, different politics, different geography, different retail markets. You know, if you're in the southeast with a nice river flowing through and a quick train into London, it's very different than if you're in the northwest and you're dealing with different issues. Which leads to Blackpool. You know, I think before COVID, there was maybe an element of people thinking this isn't as bad as it, you know, necessarily it's a retail issue, it's not just a town centre issue. And when you see images like this, you can see how phenomenal change happens from decade to decade. And clearly, from a retail perspective, the retail lease, which was beginning to decline in the last few years, has absolutely declined in the face of COVID. So what, you know, an image which shows some of the feelings I have for town centres with the cogs, you know, and it's not just a case that we can replace one cog and our town centre is going to work. Town centres have been underinvested in many places for a number of years. There might be a shiny element of some retail that's gone into, but even it's now looking like a bit of a rusty cog. So we need to find ways of looking at this holistically. So that's jobs, that's civic uses, and retail, to be honest, is one of the last things I'm thinking about. So what gives us meaning? I think that's for the local authority. You've heard them talk about it, and they have purpose. And their purpose isn't just simply about, it's all about the money. It's about the wider ESG, the social, the value, the health, the inclusive nature of the development that needs to happen. And this is certainly where I think the local authorities have a massive part to play in looking at this, and not only from the financial characteristics. I think when good strategies have been coming forward over the past couple of years, it's actually been not about the fact that retail is going, it's been the fact that generations are changing. We could add on Gen Alpha onto the right hand side of the screen as well. And what's happened to our generations with COVID? I think there's been a massive change. You know, where you thought that certain generations were going to be working and living in a certain way, it's going to be completely different now. And we, you know, the data that we use is going to have to change. And it's kind of, I think this is one of my favourite images, you know, the juxtaposition between the old and the new. And in the reality, I think we're going to be relying upon this type of delivery more and more, which is just going to put even more pressure on the high street. And as I say, it's not just about retail. It's not just about generational changes. It's about the Industrial Revolution and what's actually happening out there. And that's going to happen quicker than we ever anticipated in the use of technology. And as we've been evolving experimental and experience-led town centres. And we've all been kind of trying to develop town centres which are far more than just a component, but actually about the uses that happen. And who would have thought that, you know, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago would be experience-led town centres would then be actually looking, you know, the experience that people bring together be looking like our team meet on a Friday afternoon for drinks. But at the heart of it, still the community. And any good strategy, pre-COVID, post-COVID, has to have the community at the heart of it. I think this image is quite good at demonstrating that it's not only the community, it's how you curate and how you bring those things together, how you make that inclusive. And I think that, you know, the fact that we, you know, the amount of people we see standing on pavements on a Thursday night at 8 o'clock to appreciate all the frontline work that's been done, I think this is just going to bring our community even closer together and want to get involved, but therefore town centres need to actually respond to what they want. And that's part of that will be the collection of data. And again, I think the way COVID's going, we'll be collecting data on what's successful, what's not in town centres quicker than ever. Key to this to me is flexibility. This is a fantastic development that Chester Council have done. Cinema, theatre, library, food, it's a bar, it's co-working, it's all these things together, making that key investment, but making it flexible and adaptable. Bringing your cultural activities together, Dundee with the V&A, merging with the history of the discovery. And this is a major set piece investment, but that you know, it's not starting this with a retail strategy, but starting with a deeper employment strategy, cultural strategy, living strategy. It doesn't necessarily, you know, cultural strategies don't necessarily need to be massively expensive. You know, there can just be little creative touches that start to build a heart to town centres and make them different and differentiate them. One of the other changes I think is going to be drastic and a different priority is the climate crisis. And I think post-COVID we're going to see a huge amount. We've already seen quite a lot of number one priority by a number of councils. But I actually think we're now going to see capital investment and long-term strategies put in place around the climate crisis. And I think that'll be about the quality of the built environment. I also think that's going to be think about how cars are used, how public transport and how car parking in particular in town centres is used. One of the other things I think are very good for successful town centre strategies, pre-COVID, but even more, is the whole meanwhile use. And meanwhile use isn't just going to be a temporary thing. Meanwhile use is here to stay. How that's run is going to be a different situation. How a bid in a town works, how the council works with that, how private practice and private entrepreneurs and how the community come together to create meanwhile use, I think it's going to be critically important. But meanwhile use isn't just a short-term thing until a development site now. It's really is fundamental to the town centre. And bringing that, you know, we started with some rusty cogs and finishing off with kind of some nicer, more modern cogs, and looking at, you know, how do those all things come together. We've got two words here, workplace and culture, but that will have to include retail, it will include leisure, it will include civic, it will include public realm, it will include infrastructure, trains, etc., etc. So it's how all of those cogs, and that's the role of the local authority. It's a major role to bring all of that together. A couple of slides that I use in a presentation pre-COVID, and I wonder if these have actually changed now, and we should think about the impacts of these. You know, these stores are alive. You know, this is trying to say that, you know, modern experience retail like this is what people want. People can't do this any longer, and I don't actually know when they'll be able to do this. So how do retailers who've been developing all these strategies move on? And also from a living perspective, you know, town centres will become the living room. People living in small apartments and in rooms and shared flats with their parents, etc., etc. And they needed the town centre as a living room. They've just lost that overnight. So surely that's going to change fundamentally how they will rely upon their town centres. And a number of councils were taking this as the town centre change as urgent. Others less so. They had a number of priorities that they were having to deal with. Loss of funding from central government in particular, more access, more requirements for their services. So councils can't do everything. One of the reasons that they've chosen to go off and invest in and out of borough and commercial property to create revenues to try and deal with regeneration issues like this. And clearly this was an option for, you know, and it's always an option for any of us in these times to kind of bury our heads, but post-COVID, that is not going to be a possibility for any local authority. And, you know, I've already seen so many of them getting into the recovery phase. They're clearly having to go to the front line, but they are thinking about recovery. So some of the key themes for town centres, they need to be distinctive, so they need to be bespoke. It's not a case of what strategy did Altrincham use, we're going to copy that. It needs to be bespoke. They need to be authentic around the community and inclusive. They need a project. You need to get a stake in the ground and get a project to get started. But the core thing still comes back to leadership. There is a massive depth of private sector desire to invest into town centres. There's a massive desire of people who are currently invested in town centres to exit. All of that change is going to need to be managed. And if you look at the bringing the community, the occupier, the business aspects together, then I think that's where the local authorities bring that leadership. And that takes time and it takes commitment.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Alan. That was terrific. You've set a new benchmark in slide quality for us, and it's going to be hard to live up to, but also raise some really significant questions, particularly towards the end there, about the sort of level of change that we're facing. And let's move on to the future and put it to Mark. Mark, the question that was in the brief that I'd love it if you could pick up on, but do also feel free to reference any of the other things you've heard this morning, was could you give us an example of one role or one responsibility or intervention or initiative that you'd most like to see councils take on to support town centres through the recovery period?
Okay, thanks, Toby. Just checking I'm unmuted. It's the curse of these things as you natter away and nobody can hear you. Just before I respond to the question, yes, I will pick up on one or two things, both that I've said and expand on those and some of the others. I alluded to public realm and the things like the livable neighbourhood bids earlier. Public realm was important before. Public realm is going to be even more important after. Space. Alan showed the slide of those people doing their yoga 3 inches apart. It's not just that sort of activity. People are going to naturally continue to slightly distance themselves a bit more for a while. A lot of our town centre strategies have been heavily reliant on evening economy, introducing new leisure uses, theatres, cinemas, bars, restaurants. We've been hearing over the last couple of days that these are going to be the last things that come out of lockdown. And even when they do, many of these restrictions will apply for some time. So how can we use the space as alternative venues for entertainment? How can we help our restaurants, who can only get so many people indoors, even when they can open, because they're going to have to sit them further apart, to actually use outside space, particularly over the summer, perhaps. So as a local authority, how do we make the licensing of outdoor seating easier to get for those who haven't had it before? So there are all sorts of different things we're going to need to think about. Hand washing is a thing at the moment. Public toilets in town centres have been a challenge for a while. Are we going to need to address some of these things? So what happens in our public realm is going to be even more important going forwards. There have been a few questions from various people, some old friends, Mike Diath and others, about the role of residential in our town centres and how we can accelerate that. That's going to be even more important going forwards, and we're going to need to look at that. But my key issue going forwards, and it's in part what local authorities can do, and it's in part what government needs to give us the tools to do, is that more active investment, that more active curation, horrible word, but it describes it quite well, in what happens next. There will be gaps in our town centre, and we do not want an expansion of PDR to allow those to be filled with crap. We need some control over this. We need to make sure that our town centres don't have missing teeth dotted throughout them. We need to have the powers to consolidate, focus on where really now is the heart of the town centre, and what do we do with some of the straggly bits on the edges, and allow a greater control over that. So from our point of view, PDR has its place, but needs to be really limited and really carefully thought about. We're looking at how quickly we can introduce supplementary planning documents or guidance for our town centres, so that we can redefine those retail cores, we can identify new quarters where we expect those opportunities for development to be, because things have closed. so we don't have to wait for the local plan, so we can get on and have that guidance there. Support that with simplified planning zones, so you get the benefits of speed that PDR gives you, but without the lack of control that PDR gives you. And then we'd really like to see government simplify CPO powers, so that actually where we need to control something to make something good happen, or where we need to control something to stop something crap happening, we can do it quickly without a long bureaucratic process. For me, there's questions there from a lot of people about the role of local authorities in investment. Should we now be focusing on in town, in borough, rather than out of town? I quickly counter that by saying the amount of out of town investment, or out of borough investment by local authorities more accurately, that's been the focus of the media, is tiny compared to the total asset base of local authorities. So yes, there's a reason for it. Income is part of that, but we as local authorities already own significant amounts. What we need is greater control to build on that at speed, because the market will fill the gap, and our town centres will have an even bigger problem, because once we've got some crappy rabbit hutch PDR conversions, they're going to be bloody difficult to get rid of.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
can we get in there first and fast?
Yeah, excellent, Mark. Thank you. I'll ask Alan in a second to come back on, perhaps bring some of Montagu Evans' breadth of experience to talk a little bit about those relative weights of investment for different councils across the country. Connor, is there anything you'd like to add to that or pick up on? And also, could you give us your one sort of intervention responsibility role that the council might pick up to support town centres post-COVID-19?
Yeah, I'll give one of those, but just picking up on some of the comments made so far by the panelists and some of the questions coming in. I think this pandemic's provided a massive opportunity and a real mandate now for all of us to be much more radical and progressive about how we repurpose and reimagine our town centres. If it doesn't happen now, it'll never happen. I think that's the key thing we need to keep in our mind. It's not about retail anymore. It's about places to dwell, meet friends, access essential health services, places for social integration, culture, leisure, recreation. And some of the things that Dawn mentioned already in her strategies are very interesting, and maybe we can pick up that maybe later, because I want to maybe do something similar in Ealing about acquisition of key assets within town centres, so we take more control of how town centres are redeveloped and reimagined. One of the ideas I've been thinking about is how we can be a bit more proactive in developing stronger relationships with landlords, particularly those landlords that own large swathes of town centres. And some of these landlords are quite faceless sometimes, and they don't really play an active stewardship role in the town centre. They're just happy with taking the rents from their tenants. But now with this pandemic, there could be a situation where there's many leases that have been forfeited. There's going to be lots of voids for these landlords. So I think now is a real opportunity for us to actually get them around the table and have proper serious conversations what they're doing with their assets. That could be around even acquiring their assets, or maybe either by freehold or head leasehold. It could be about encouraging them to be a bit more ambitious about the types of tenants they get in there and the types of leases they want to give those tenants to allow more flexibility. Particularly for micro businesses and SMEs and those and the sectors that are emerging now, the more high-tech sectors. Another good example I would like to draw to people's attention is how local authorities themselves can use their assets a bit better. So my previous job at Enfield Council, we worked with Tree Space to take over International House in Brixton. And that's been a real success story. So my colleagues in that feel on that, the folk from the business and culture investment team done a really good job there. And it's a really good example I would suggest people have a look at. And that's all about getting really small businesses, startups all set up. And they just add so much value and diversity to our town centres now. And I think we should explore more of those examples in the future. And some left field ideas in regards to speaking with landlords. With the millennials and the Generation Z that Alan referred to earlier, I think, and with many local authorities now having declared climate emergencies, I think there's a real opportunity to look at what type of circular economy uses we can get within our town centres, bartering economy uses, Upcycling, could we repurpose some of these big department stores as really interesting places to do lots of stuff like that? Could we think about incentivizing and rewarding businesses similar to what we do with the food hygiene ratings, the sustainability ratings, etc.? Just giving a bit more interest and diversity to what our town centres offer. So yeah, I think I won't go on much more because we're going short of time. But I think the key thing is how we work with our landlords better and how we build better relationships with them. I think that's the key thing I'll be working on in Ealing.
So what I'm picking up from both of you now is certainly higher levels of intervention, significantly higher levels of intervention and interaction by councils in town centres.
Yeah.
Dawn, I know that you've got a particular interest in bids and how bids are responding to the crisis at the moment. And so if there are any bids out there, we've got about 300 people watching. If any of you are bids, we really welcome your comments on what you're doing and how you're responding. But Dawn, is that picture of intervention, is that the same in Medway? Are you looking for significantly higher levels of intervention? And what is the one most significant, the one thing you'd most like to see happening post-crisis?
Thank you. I think we were already making high levels of intervention in Chatham Town Centre. And I'm really grateful that we were, because it's put us in perhaps a stronger position than we otherwise would have been. There's been some really interesting questions coming through during this about demographics of town centre living and whether or not we're going to be reliant on people who work normally living in town centres. That's interesting because actually I've been thinking more about accommodating senior population in town centres and key workers and students rather than commuters. So I think that's something that does need to be considered. I mean, there are the big things, aren't they, that, you know, we would all, everybody in the retail sector or involved in the retail sector would like to see business rates for retail completely reviewed. They are one of the biggest challenges alongside rents for the retail sector. I think local councils, especially as we're first coming out of the pandemic, will really need to think about parking charges. You know, it's something that always comes up, and that will really need to be considered. There's some really great examples around the country of looking at local supply chains and investing in your local economy through local supply chains. In terms of Medway Council, all our investments go in Medway. We do not invest in out of Medway, and I think that's really important. I think what we're going to have to do is think more about why we invest in things, and we take a mixed economy approach to that. Some of our investments are for commercial gain, but some of them are purely for regeneration, and we don't look to return a profit or a surplus from those things, and we're probably going to have to do more of that. Especially where we've invested in retail, because you know, we as I said, we bought the Pentagon Centre. You know, are we still going to get the same returns from that? Probably not going forward. But we were already thinking about how we diversified the use within the centre and bringing more civic uses and more leisure uses. I asked my team this week about if they could do one big thing, no matter how crazy, to help our town centres come out of this, what would it be? And it was quite interesting because they didn't go as crazy as I thought they might. Maybe they didn't believe I was asking the question. But most of what came out, because I got quite a lot of responses from them, was around this point about being a destination. And Alan said, I really loved what Alan said about the town centres being the living room for a lot of people who live in and maybe small properties or house shares. And that's where we were going anyway. It was destinations, town centres being more than about retail. And therefore, for me, it's about animating them. And what we can do as local authorities, one of the things we can do is bring that animation to the town centre, bring activity into the town centres, into the public realm spaces. That's going to be challenging at the beginning, short term, because of social distancing. But we've got to break that problem. And the meanwhile use point is really important, and through our future High Streets Fund bid, we are going to be purchasing some small retail units that will be absolutely permanently used for meanwhile use and helping people see if their business model works. I think a big challenge, and this is supposed to be about what can we do, but permitted development rights are going to get even more of a challenge, especially if the commercial office market shrinks, which I think it's likely to do, businesses are already saying to us, we don't need these offices, we're saving a fortune by all our staff working at home. And so I think we're going to see a shrinkage in that market, which will leave more empty office blocks potentially for permitted development rights. And the government's really, really going to have to do something about that, because it's caused most local authorities a huge problem.
I suspect there's a connection between that issue and the issue of business rates as well, which you described. I know my own accountant will be delighted to hear you call for a reform of business rates at this stage, and I'm sure that I speak for many businesses around the country in that. Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, Dom. That's fantastic. So we've got a lot of exciting opportunities to do some exciting stuff in town centres. Alan, what experience can you bring to bear at Montagu Evans in terms of what councils across the country are doing and how that resonates with what we've heard today? And what would you most like to see councils doing to intervene in the town centre to support recovery?
Yeah, well, I know it doesn't seem right to use the word exciting right now, when there's all of the hardship that people are going through, but I do think it's exciting, and I do think it's going to accelerate it massively. We were delighted to be part of the team that was involved in the purchase of the shopping centre that Don's talking about, Pentagon. We were supporting the private sector in that conversation. We often support the public sector as well. But to kind of be that, to bring that conversation together, demonstrated to me as well that absolutely the Medway Council are the right owners of that shopping centre. They had the ground lease, they had the adjacent car park. So I think one of the first things that I'd like to have a real focus on, and we're doing an initiative to offer councils help at the moment to look at mapping out the ownerships in their town centres so they can think about how they can have those conversations, is that front end. There is no shortage of money of people wanting to invest in town centres. We get knocks on the door every week from global funds, often with high ESG credentials, saying we want to do this in a sustainable way as well, wanting to invest. But you do have owners who for whatever be their book value or their focus, aren't ready or can't get out of their town centre. So to bring that conversation together, I think something that we're very, very focused at, public-private. So that front end piece of work, I think is key. The end, and I was really interested in your first comment you made around a council leader who was talking about running a pub. I think that whole operational model is at the end, how our town centres are actually going to run. And again, local authorities run leisure centres, run car parks, they run the public realm, they run, they run housing solutions, etc. How are local authorities going to innovate and work with the private sector who are there to innovate and bring together a new operational model for town centres that make it a very, very investable entity that we, I think we'll see, significant funds wanting to come in. So, front end, back end, I think there are lots of innovation. I think it's just about having conversations and with people who have learned from these projects kind of before. Clearly, rating, Monty's have got a big rating team. We see that as an issue. We've got a big CPO team. We see that as an issue. But the whole public-private conversation is a bit that we want to support most.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much for that. I think the comment about councils running the pubs was based on the initial observation was that the private sector's closed the doors. The pubs have closed the doors to the community. The community can't get in. They're not allowed to get in even if they were open. So what could a council do with that space that would help bring it back into use? There's a huge garden. Could that become a market? Could it become a creche? There's the opportunity to distribute food. There's an opportunity to create kind of community coming together in the old-fashioned use of a pub, the old role of a pub in a town centre. Okay, so the most popular question from our audience at the moment is on a very specific detail. So I'll because it's so popular, I'll put it to the panel. But in essence, it's how important do you think super flexibility in use class and planning designation is going to be to high streets in the future? So let's go around the panel and see if there's a quick answer to that. Mark, what's your view on planning designations and what we can do to make them flexible and how useful that would be?
Yeah, I sort of alluded to that in my earlier response, that as part of SPD and simplified planning zones, we do need, say it's controlled flexibility is what we're after. That level of a level of control that is appropriate to ensure quality, but is not so bureaucratic as to delay things unnecessarily. So yeah, we do need to be much more flexible. We do need to move away, and local plans are already starting to do that. And that's why I suggested that an SPD approach might bring some of the stuff we're already doing in faster. So
great stuff, Mark.
Short answer is yes. We need to be more flexible, but not at the expense of total free for all.
Connor, would you echo that?
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. I think the use class disorder is it's not really fit for purpose now, particularly in this pandemic's really starting to show that. But what we need to be very careful about is how that's enforced and how we actually ensure that the flexibility doesn't harm the amenities of those residents who might live in town centres. Because to make town centres viable, we want to get more residents in there. So it's going to be quite a challenge, but I think we've got good minds around the country that can think of that. I mean, it needs to be co-developed properly with businesses, with the bids and other key partners, because they know best how town centres operate. And there's already some examples within various towns and cities about how different buildings are used differently across the week. How could we take those ideas and scale them up for town centres across the country? So short answer is yes.
Great, thanks, Connor. And yes from you, Dawn?
Absolutely, yes. I think town centre master plans are even more important than ever, because we want to encourage mixed use development and new uses in our town centres, but you've still got to plan it properly. You've still got to have your master plan to facilitate those changes of uses, and having that vision about where you want to go is even more important than ever, I think.
Great stuff. Alan, are we talking about the art of the possible here?
Yeah, well, I don't think we are overly concerned about necessarily the flexibility of planning, because I think if the planning authority and the investor talk enough, there's solutions to be found there, and there's ways around it. It's the commerciality that makes it more difficult. Clearly, PDR is created some teeth, I think was what Mark said in certain locations. So I don't know. For us, it's not necessarily so much about planning flexibility, but it's just recognising that town centres are going to be so many different things. We're all fans of master plans as well, but I don't think we want to be prescriptive on any uses. We want to be prescriptive on where the streets go and how the traffic moves around and where the infrastructure is, what actually goes on in end use. On a building block, I think we need to be massively flexible at that planning, and we're seeing lots more outline planning applications with no detail at all because of that flexibility that's required.
Yeah, absolutely. What about the sort of elephant in the room of funding? I mean, all of this intervention is based on public sector funding, on money being available to the public sector to wield in our town centres. The government has already borrowed enormous amounts of money, and the hit on GDP looks to be significantly larger than we initially thought. What thoughts have you got on the likelihood of I'll start with Alan on this, on the likelihood of the funding actually being available to local authorities to intervene in these ways?
I think in the short term, there's clearly concern that PWLB is going to be stopped. Many local authorities are using it appropriately to do in-borough regeneration and support economic growth, and at the same time try to deal with the funding issues that they have. In the longer term, I don't think any of us knows what's going to happen in terms of the way the government's going to fund it. But there are different ways. It just doesn't have to just be public sector. Connor talked about reuse of existing assets. Other councils like Sunderland have been quite innovative with leases to institutional investors in the long term because their covenant's so valuable. So I think it doesn't just need to be, can we lend from PWLB? There is capital in the world who wants to invest here. So I think if you use a mix and a kind of a portfolio composition of borrowing and inward investment, as opposed to just simply using one source, I think that'll be far more robust in the future.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Alan. Okay, we're in the last minute of the webinar. Everyone's going to start getting ready for their next meeting now. So I'd just like to pick up on one point that Alan made and acknowledge that that people are dying, and talking about town centres and the future of retail and so on just seems immensely trivial in relation to that. But I do think that that our responsibility is to look forward and not back, and to look at what we can do to help in this situation. And I think that the problem is approaching us of how town centres are going to cope with the behavioural changes and the economic changes. So I'm really grateful to our panel for taking time from the enormously strenuous responsibilities that are being placed on local authorities right now. I'm absolutely delighted that you've spared an hour to share your experiences and your thoughts with our audience. It's very, very thoughtful and kind of you, and hope that that you survive the next few weeks in good health, and manage to cope with the burdens that that COVID is placing on you. I'd like to thank also Montagu Evans for making this session possible. It's terrific to be working with them and helping them bring their experience to bear on these issues. You'll find a recording and report of this session on the voiceofauthority.co.uk tomorrow, along with well over 120 interviews now with top people at councils about the various issues and challenges facing them. I'd like to thank our audience for their attention, for all the questions that you've been putting to us throughout this. I very much hope that we've got through enough to satisfy you, and the panel have been terrific at responding to those questions as they've come up. Some of those questions have dealt with employment, workspace, and we've talked a bit about PDR. Next week's session is going to be on workspace and the commercial development scene post-pandemic. And I very much look forward to seeing you all then. But in the meantime, thank you to our panel. I'm assuming that there are huge rounds of virtual applause ringing around the country to thank you for your time and your concentration today. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.
Thank you, Toby.
Thanks, Toby. Goodbye.